There are countless ways to hear the voice of God in the world, the voice of your truest and highest self, regardless of the words that you use to identify this presence of God that is within each and every one of us. Many people think, either consciously or subconsciously, that the only true way to hear this inner voice of God is to hear an audible, distinct voice that is perceived to be separate or somehow different than their own. This belief has risen in part because there are so many stories, both past and present, of people hearing God's voice in this way. This is the experience that many people have in the world, and it's one of the ways that we personally experience hearing God's voice, and one of the techniques we actually teach. However, one very important step in opening up to hearing this voice within you in a very clear and recognizable way is validating how you already hear God's voice. God's voice can be heard in many different ways. God can speak to you through signs, feeling, and intuition. God's voice can be heard as a sense of knowingness or through other symbols in the world, such as books, music, muscle testing, or so many other methods. There are countless ways to hear this voice in your life. If you wish to open up to hearing God's voice as a distinct and conversational voice within you, the very first thing to do is validate how you already hear this voice in your life. My life is a great example of the importance of doing this, because before I ever began hearing God's voice as a clear and recognizable voice within me, I discounted and disbelieved all the other ways of hearing this voice in my life. I believed that the only valid and meaningful way to hear God's voice was as a loud and audible voice within me. And as a result, I struggled and cried out with frustration, anger, tears, and so many other things at not being able to hear this voice in the way that I wanted and really thought I should. Feeling utterly hopeless, I oftentimes cursed and cried myself to sleep and prayed to even give up the desire to hear this voice because the struggle was so agonizing for me. I realize now, though, that I experienced this heartache for only one reason. I was attached to hearing God's voice as an audible voice in my head. I believed it was the only valid way to hear this voice. After several years of heartache and a lot of counseling from this voice through Candace, my wife, who did hear God's voice in a very conversational way, I eventually let go of this dream and accepted the importance of acknowledging and validating the ways that I did already hear this voice. Contemplating, validating, and acknowledging how I already heard God's voice in many different ways was the first critical step in opening my mind to the possibility that I could hear God's voice, that I, in fact, did hear God's voice, and that ultimately all ways of hearing God's voice are equal. By changing my perceptions and beliefs about God's voice, I was able to open my mind to new possibilities. I was able to open my heart to experiencing God's voice in new ways, and it was only after I had developed a strong, comfortable, peaceful, and validating relationship with God that I eventually opened up to hearing this voice as a distinct and conversational voice within me. Now, I'm not saying that you have to follow in my footsteps in order to hear God's voice in this way, but I do know that acknowledging, validating, and giving thanks for the ways that you do already hear God's voice will put you in the right mindset for hearing God's voice more fully in your life. Spend some time today and over the course of this week recognizing and validating how you do hear God's voice. Give yourself the opportunity to acknowledge the ways you do hear this voice, the clarity, the insight, and the guidance that you do receive. When you recognize, validate, and give energy into what already is, or show appreciation for what you already have, that positive, loving energy builds and grows on itself. When students of ours fail to acknowledge all the ways they hear God's voice and they become attached to or even obsessed with hearing in a specific way, I find that it is much more difficult for them to open up to hearing God's voice within them because they're constantly telling themselves that they don't hear God's voice, that they're not hearing God's voice, and that they can't do it. When you say those types of messages to yourself over and over again, you actually lock in or solidify that way of thinking and that experience even more. Take some time to acknowledge how you already hear this voice in your life. Make peace with what you do have. Enjoy how you are already connected with and hear this voice for peace and love in your life. Taking time now to do so is a powerful way to begin opening up to hearing this voice in new and different ways. Begin this process today so that you have a strong foundation for moving forward in hearing God's voice more fully in your life. Have a fantastic day. I love you, and I'll speak with you soon. Blessings to you.